I was the silent engine behind a $47M empire. The night they promoted my brother for my work, I quietly burned it all down and built my own. I'm Mara Chen, 31 years old, and last Tuesday night my father stood in front of 200 shareholders, venture partners, and industry colleagues, and told them that my brother Daniel was the architect of our future, while the 80-page strategic transformation roadmap he was gesturing to on the screen behind him was one I had written alone over 14 months of lunch breaks, weekend mornings, and 3 consecutive New Year's Eves. Let me be precise about that moment, because precision is what I do for a living. I am a lead systems architect. My professional existence is defined by the ability to look at something extraordinarily complex, a tangle of legacy infrastructure, competing stakeholder demands, regulatory exposure, and long-term capital risk, and reduce it to a clean, legible framework. I find the load-bearing walls. I identify the single points of failure. I map the dependencies that nobody else has bothered to trace. So when my father, Richard Chen, stood at the podium of the Meridian Grand Ballroom, in front of the people who had trusted our family's firm with their capital and their futures, and credited my brother Daniel with the intellectual work that had occupied the most productive years of my professional life, my first response was not grief. It was not rage. It was the very specific, very quiet sensation of running a diagnostic on a system and discovering that the corruption was not a recent intrusion. It had always been there. You had simply, finally, stopped ignoring the error logs. There was a ringing in my ears, not loud, nothing so dramatic as that. It was more like the sound a fluorescent light makes in an empty office at 2 in the morning. A frequency so constant you stop registering it as sound at all, until suddenly the building goes quiet enough for you to hear it for what it is. The world did not spin. It did not shatter. It simply divided itself, cleanly and irrevocably, into the time before that sentence and everything that came after. I sat at table 14. I will tell you about table 14 in a moment, and I held my glass of sparkling water, and I watched 200 people applaud my brother, and I performed the calculations. Before we go any further, if you find this kind of story useful, not as entertainment, but as a record of how systems fail and how they can be rebuilt, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I don't tell this story for catharsis. I tell it because the structural patterns here are ones I have seen replicated across dozens of professional contexts, and because someone, somewhere, is currently sitting at their own version of table 14. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I want to know who is reading this, and when, and where. Part 1. The infrastructure of the Thing Chen Logistics Solutions was founded by my father in 1994, when he was 28 years old and operating out of a warehouse in the East Side Industrial District with 12 employees and 2 truck contracts. By the time I entered the firm in 2019, it had grown into a mid-market supply chain and distribution consultancy with 340 employees, offices in 4 cities, and an annual revenue of approximately $47 million. I want you to hold that number, $47 million. My father is a man of considerable charisma and very particular beliefs about how families should function. The central belief, the one that organized everything else the way a keystone organizes an arch, was this: men lead, and women support the men who lead. He had never said this out loud. To my knowledge, he did not need to. It was encoded in the structure of every decision he had ever made. It was, in the language of my profession, a design principle. The architecture of the family expressed it without ambiguity. Daniel is 3 years older than me. He has always been, in the vocabulary my family applied to him, golden. Not because of any specific achievement. Daniel's academic record was average, his professional instincts untested, his appetite for sustained intellectual effort limited by what I will charitably describe as a preference for the visible over the laborious. He is golden because he is the son, and because he is charming, and because my father saw in him a version of himself that he wanted to persist into the next generation. I was brought into the firm with the title of Senior Systems Analyst. My actual function was more accurately described as follows. I was the person who built the things that made the firm work in the spaces that no one was publicly watching. In my first year, I redesigned the firm's entire logistics routing algorithm, reducing dead mileage by 23% and saving the company approximately $1.2 million in annual fuel and labor costs. This was reported to the board as an operational optimization initiative championed by the operations division, which at that time was nominally led by Daniel. In my second year, I identified a structural vulnerability in our vendor contract framework that exposed the firm to approximately $4 million in potential liability under newly revised commercial code regulations. I drafted the remediation protocol, renegotiated 11 of our 14 primary vendor agreements, and presented the corrected framework to our legal team. This was documented in the firm's annual risk report as a strategic risk realignment associated with Daniel's leadership portfolio. Daniel, for the record, had attended 2 of the 11 renegotiation meetings, had asked no substantive questions in either, and had spent a portion of the second one responding to text messages. My salary in year 1 was $68,000. Daniel's starting salary, as I would later document with precision, was $157,000, plus a company vehicle, a silver Mercedes GLE that was expensed through the firm's transportation budget, plus a monthly expense account with a ceiling I was never formally told, but which I eventually calculated. Through the accounts, I managed to be approximately $4,200. I lived in a third-floor walk-up in the Kellerton district, 612 square feet. The elevator had been broken for the 3 years prior to my moving in and remained broken for the duration of my tenancy. My rent was $1,340 per month, which I paid without complaint because I had been told, explicitly and by my father, that I should pay my dues before expecting the firm to recognize my contributions with compensation commensurate to my role. I want to be careful here not to editorialize, because this story does not require editorializing. The facts are sufficient, so let me simply note, I was paying dues. Daniel was collecting dividends on dues I was paying. At family dinners, Sunday dinners at my parents' home in Halcyon Heights, a suburb of sufficient elegance that the houses have names rather than numbers, the distribution of seating was as follows. My parents sat at the heads of the formal dining room table. Daniel sat to my father's right. Daniel's wife, Priya, sat to Daniel's right. Various family friends and business associates occupied the remaining seats at the formal table. I sat at the secondary table, a round 4-person table positioned in the adjoining breakfast nook, which my mother had decorated with a smaller floral centerpiece to indicate that it was not an afterthought, which it was. My role at these dinners, as I came to understand it, was to be available for questions of a technical nature when the conversation at the main table turned to business, and to otherwise remain unobtrusive. I was not so much a participant in the family narrative as I was a resource it could access when needed. On at least 4 occasions that I recorded, my father referred to me to business associates as Daniel's technical support, not as his daughter. Not as a senior member of the firm's operational leadership, as Daniel's technical support. I noted this. I noted everything, not because I was planning anything at that stage. I was not. But because I am a systems architect, and the documentation of anomalies is not a strategy, it is a reflex. Part 2. The 14 months the project that became known, publicly and internally, as the Meridian Initiative, began in the spring of 2022, when I identified what I assessed to be an existential inflection point in the firm's business model. The mid-market logistics consultancy space was undergoing a structural transformation driven by 3 concurrent forces: the maturation of AI-assisted route optimization tools that were commoditizing our core technical offering, a consolidation wave among our primary client base that was compressing margins, and an emerging regulatory environment around carbon emissions reporting that was creating both compliance burden and, for firms positioned correctly, significant new opportunity. My assessment, which I developed over approximately 6 weeks of analysis conducted during hours that were not compensated by the firm. Was that Chen Logistics Solutions had a window of approximately 18 to 24 months to either reposition itself as a premium integrated supply chain intelligence firm or begin an irreversible decline toward either acquisition or dissolution. I built the model. I stress-tested it against 8 different market scenarios. I drafted the strategic framework. I developed the implementation roadmap, the capital allocation plan, the talent acquisition strategy, and the client transition protocol. I designed the proprietary risk scoring methodology that sat at the center of the whole architecture, a framework I called the Cascade Resilience Index, which assessed supply chain vulnerability across 17 distinct variables and produced a single composite score that clients could use to benchmark themselves against industry peers. The full document was 82 pages in its first draft. By the time I considered it complete, it was 94 pages, including appendices. I worked on it during lunch. I worked on it on Sunday mornings before my parents' dinners, sitting at my kitchen table in my 612-square-foot apartment with coffee that had gone cold. I worked on it on the 3 New Year's Eves that fell within the project timeline, because the people I might otherwise have spent those evenings with had, over the years, learned that I was not reliably available, because the firm consumed the hours that might have gone to availability. I sent a preliminary draft to my father in October 2022 with a cover memo explaining the strategic logic and requesting a meeting to discuss implementation. He responded 11 days later with a message that read in its entirety, "Good work, leave it with me." I have that message saved. I have saved everything. In January 2023, Daniel presented the Meridian Initiative to the firm's senior leadership team. I was not in the room. I was told the meeting conflicted with a vendor call I needed to manage, a call that could, I later confirmed, have been rescheduled. The presentation deck Daniel used was derived from my document. The Cascade Resilience Index was introduced as a proprietary methodology developed by the Chen Logistics strategic team. In the meeting notes, which I obtained through the firm's internal documentation system, the initiative was attributed to Daniel's strategic vision. I sat with this information for a period of time before I decided what to do about it. That period of time was approximately 4 months. During those 4 months, I continued to do my job. I attended the meetings I was invited to attend. I answered the questions I was asked. I contributed the analyses that were requested of me, and some that were not. I was, by every external measure, a cooperative and productive member of the firm's operational leadership. Internally, I was conducting an audit. Part 3. The audit, the practice of forensic accounting, is, at its core, about the reconstruction of truth from evidence. You do not begin with a conclusion. You begin with a question. Where did this value originate? And where did it go? And you follow the data wherever it leads with the emotional temperature of a thermostat. I am not an accountant, but I am a systems architect, which means I understand how information moves through an organization, where it is stored, and how to recover the traces it leaves behind when someone has attempted to obscure its origin. I began with the patent applications. The Cascade Resilience Index had been developed as a proprietary methodology with potential commercial licensing value. In April 2023, I discovered, through a search of publicly available intellectual property filings, that a patent application had been submitted for a supply chain vulnerability assessment framework that was, in its technical specifications, substantively identical to the CRI methodology I had developed. The filing listed the inventor as Daniel Richard Chen. I sat with that page open on my screen for a long time. Then I printed it, put it in a manila folder, and labeled the folder with today's date and the words source documentation. That folder was the first of 11. Over the following 7 months, I reconstructed the complete evidentiary record of my contributions to the firm. I did this methodically, without urgency, the way you would approach any complex system restoration project. I pulled the original timestamped drafts from my personal cloud storage. I had, from the beginning of my employment, maintained duplicates of every significant work product in a private account, not because I was suspicious, but because I treat data redundancy as a professional obligation. I compiled the email chains, the version histories, the internal messaging logs. I documented the dates on which each deliverable had been created, the dates on which it had been submitted, and the dates on which it had subsequently been attributed to Daniel in external or internal communications. I also began to look at the financial architecture of the firm with more attention than I had previously applied to it. What I found, over a period of several months of careful review, was that the firm's capital structure had certain features that my father believed I was unaware of, because he had not told me about them and had not expected me to find them. These included a series of operating loans secured against the firm's projected revenue, loans whose covenant structure created significant exposure in the event of certain triggering events. I also found that several of the firm's most significant client relationships I had personally developed and maintained, were governed by contracts that named me, specifically, as the relationship manager, with clauses that gave those clients termination rights in the event of my departure from the firm. I documented all of this. I shared none of it. There was one person I spoke to during this period, and only one. Her name is Alina Marsh, and she has been my father's corporate attorney for 22 years. She is 67 years old, was the first woman partner at her firm, and has opinions about the treatment of professional women that she expresses with the contained precision of someone who has spent decades choosing her words in rooms where every word had consequences. Alina had drafted the original articles of incorporation for Chen Logistics Solutions. She had also, I discovered through a conversation that began as a routine legal question and evolved over several months into something considerably more significant, drafted several early equity agreements that my father had subsequently amended in ways that she considered, in her careful legal vocabulary, irregular. Alina did not tell me what to do. She told me what the documents said. She told me what the applicable statutes provided. She told me who had signed what, and when, and under what representation. And then she told me that if I ever needed a letter of attestation regarding the origin of certain intellectual property, she was in a position to provide one, because she had been present at enough early board meetings to have formed her own views about where certain ideas had come from. I thanked her. I added her letter to the 11th Manila folder. Then I waited for the right occasion. Part 4. The occasion, the Meridian Grand Ballroom of the Harrington Hotel, is a room designed for the performance of significance. It holds 300 people comfortably and has hosted, over its history, charity galas, political fundraisers, and the kind of industry dinners at which the guests understand that they are not merely eating dinner, but participating in the construction of reputation. My father had booked it for the occasion of Chen Logistics Solutions' 30th anniversary, which coincided with what he had chosen to present as a generational transition, his formal announcement of Daniel's elevation to the position of Chief Executive Officer. I had known for 6 weeks that this announcement was coming. I had been told by my father in a phone call that lasted approximately 4 minutes that Daniel was being promoted, that this was what was best for the firm's future, and that he hoped I would continue to be a team player. He did not ask for my input. He did not acknowledge what the announcement would mean relative to my own professional contributions. He told me that Daniel's leadership of the Meridian Initiative had demonstrated his readiness for the role. I said, "I understand, thank you for letting me know. I have replayed that phone call many times in the months since. I think my father heard in my response what he wanted to hear: acquiescence, accommodation. The sound of a useful person accepting a useful person's place. What he did not hear, because he was not listening for it, was the particular quality of silence that follows a decision that has already been made." I spent the 6 weeks between that phone call and the gala completing preparations that I will describe in order. First, I engaged outside counsel. Not Alina, who was too closely connected to the family's existing legal relationships to serve as my primary advocate, but a firm specializing in intellectual property litigation and employment law. My lead attorney was a woman named Patricia Owens, who had spent 15 years litigating IP theft cases with a record that I reviewed carefully before retaining her. I provided Patricia with all 11 manila folders. She and her team spent 3 weeks conducting their own verification of the documentary record. Patricia's assessment, delivered in her characteristic economy of language, was, "You have an unusually complete evidentiary record." Most people don't document this well. I explained that I was a systems architect. She said that made sense. Second, I filed a formal copyright registration for the original Meridian Initiative document and the Cascade Resilience Index methodology, establishing the legal record of authorship with a timestamp, predating the firm's use of the material in any external communication. This was a procedural step that had no immediate effect, but that would prove significant later. Third, I reviewed the client contracts I had identified as containing relationship-specific clauses. 3 of our top 5 clients, accounting for approximately $14.3 million in annual revenue, had contracts that named me as essential personnel. I had quiet conversations with the relevant contacts at each of these clients. I did not tell them what I was planning. I asked them, in the context of routine relationship management, whether they were satisfied with my work and whether they valued the continuity of their current operational support. The answers were, in each case, enthusiastically affirmative. Fourth, I prepared the materials I would need for the evening of the gala. These materials included a forensic summary document, not the full 94-page strategic framework, but a tight 15-page evidentiary abstract that a non-technical reader could follow without difficulty, and a brief technical presentation, 8 slides, designed to display cleanly on the ballroom's projection system. I had confirmed with the hotel's AV coordinator, under the guise of a routine technical check, that the ballroom's projection system could be accessed via a specific wireless protocol. I had also confirmed the network credentials, which were, as is depressingly common in large venue AV setups, not significantly secured. Fifth, I arranged for Patricia's firm to have everything ready to file at a moment's notice. The intellectual property claim, the demand letter, the cease and desist regarding the patent application, everything was prepared, reviewed, signed, and sitting in an electronic queue, waiting for a single instruction to transmit. On the evening of the gala, I wore a dark blue dress that I had bought specifically for this occasion. I arrived at the Meridian Grand Ballroom at 6:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the doors opened, and I took my assigned seat, table 14. Of the 14 tables in the ballroom, table 14 was positioned farthest from the podium, nearest to the service corridor. The table seated 8. My other table mates included 2 junior account managers, who were there primarily to manage logistics, a retired board member whose relevance to the current firm was largely ceremonial, and 3 spouses of more senior employees who had been assigned seats consistent with their perceived status. I was the only person at table 14 who had built a significant portion of the thing being celebrated. I drank water. I ate the salad course. I listened to the speeches. There were 4 speakers before my father. Each one said something complimentary about the firm's history, something forward-looking about the firm's future, and something laudatory about Daniel's leadership of the Meridian Initiative. By the 4th speaker, the attribution of my work to my brother had been publicly affirmed so many times that it had begun to acquire the texture of received truth. My father took the podium at 8:23 p.m. Richard Chen is a gifted speaker. He has the kind of voice that makes rooms pay attention, deep, measured, carrying a quality of deliberate weight that signals to listeners that what they are about to hear has been carefully considered and is therefore worth receiving carefully. He spoke for 11 minutes about the firm's origins, about his own journey, about what it meant to build something that could outlast its founder. He was, by the standards of corporate event speechmaking, excellent. And then he turned to Daniel, who was seated at the head table, and he said, "The man who will carry this firm into the next 30 years is not just my son. He is the architect of our future." The Meridian Initiative, the strategy that will define Chen Logistics Solutions for the decade ahead, bears his vision, his intelligence, his commitment to this family's legacy. He paused. He smiled at Daniel. The room applauded. I set down my glass of water. I stood up. Part 5. The interruption. Standing up at a corporate gala dinner is not, in itself, a remarkable act. People stand up to go to the restroom, to refresh their drinks, to move between conversations. The act does not immediately command attention. What commands attention is the subsequent behavior. Specifically, walking with measured pace toward the AV equipment station at the side of the room, removing a device from your evening bag, connecting it to the wireless system with practiced efficiency, and watching the projection screen behind the podium change. The Cascade Resilience Index appeared first, the original version with its creation timestamp visible in the document metadata, March 14, 2022, 12:47 p.m. authored by Mara Chen. 12 seconds later, every phone in the room received a notification. Patricia's firm had sent, to each of the 200 registered attendees, whose contact information had been included in the gala's own RSVP communications, information that had been publicly accessible via the event's own confirmation system, a brief, formally worded notice. The notice stated that Chen Logistics Solutions was the subject of an intellectual property claim regarding the Meridian Initiative and its component methodologies. It included a summary of the copyright registration and a reference to the pending patent challenge. It directed recipients to preserve any relevant documents. The sound that followed was the specific sound of 200 phones vibrating within approximately the same 5-second window. My father had stopped speaking. He was looking at the screen. His expression underwent a series of rapid transitions that I observed with the detached interest of someone watching a system process, an input it was not designed to handle. Daniel was looking at his phone, then at the screen, then at me. I walked to the podium. My father did not step aside immediately. I waited with patience until he did. I want to be precise about what I said because I prepared it carefully and I delivered it without deviation. Good evening. My name is Mara Chen, and I am the lead systems architect of Chen Logistics Solutions. I am also, as the documentation now displayed and distributed tonight confirms, the sole author of the Meridian Initiative and the Cascade Resilience Index. The evidentiary record supporting this, which includes time-stamped drafts, original version histories, independent attestation from legal counsel present at early development discussions, and copyright registration, predating all external use of this material, has been filed with our intellectual property attorneys and is being submitted to the relevant regulatory authorities as of this evening. I want to be clear that this action is not about this room, or this evening, or the 30 years this company has been building toward. It is about the record. The record has been incorrect. It is now being corrected. I apologize to our shareholders and partners for the disruption. You deserve accurate information about where this firm's strategic value originates, because that information is directly relevant to the quality of the asset in which you have placed your trust. I stepped back from the podium. The room was very quiet. I returned to my seat at table 14 and finished my water. Part 6. The silence and what it revealed. The particular silence of a room in which a professional fiction has just been publicly dissolved has a quality distinct from ordinary quiet. It is not the silence of respect, or of attention, or of anticipation. It is the silence of recalibration, of 200 separate cognitive systems simultaneously processing an input that does not fit their existing models and working to construct a new framework that accommodates it. Several people in that room knew things they had chosen not to examine. The 2 venture partners at table 3, who had reviewed the Meridian Initiative documentation and found it analytically sophisticated in ways that Daniel's other contributions had not suggested he was capable of. the senior client from Hartfield Distribution, at table 7, who had noticed that his conversations with Daniel about technical implementation had always seemed to require a follow-up call with me to actually resolve. The 3 board members scattered across the room who had, at various points, received strategic analyses from the Chen team that demonstrated a level of systems, thinking they had not been able to reconcile with the person in whose name those analyses arrived. They had filed these observations in the category of things that are noted but not pursued, because pursuing them would have required a willingness to confront the structure they were benefiting from. The silence ended when one of the venture partners, a woman named Ruth Caldwell who had been in the industry for 31 years and had, I would later learn, formed her own quiet suspicions, said clearly and without drama, "Mara, I'd like to see the full documentation." That sentence was the crack in the wall through which everything else eventually flowed. Daniel did not speak during the silence. This was, in retrospect, the most significant piece of evidence the evening produced, more significant, in some ways, than any of the documents I had displayed. When the room began to murmur, when people began to turn to each other and ask questions, when Ruth Caldwell made her request, every eye moved to Daniel. And Daniel, the architect of the future, the bearer of his father's vision, the strategic intelligence behind a framework that was about to transform the firm, had nothing to say, because he did not know what to say, because he did not know the material. Because you cannot defend a thing you did not build. My father knew this. I watched him understand it in real time, the way you watch a load-bearing calculation fail, not dramatically, but with a kind of structural inevitability that is almost boring once you know what you are looking at. He did not look at me, he looked at Daniel, and I think, in that moment, he saw something he had been carefully not seeing for a very long time. Part 7. The structural failure the days following the gala proceeded in the manner of a controlled demolition. Not explosive. I had not designed it to be explosive, but methodical load-bearing element by load-bearing element. The intellectual property claim was filed formally the following morning. The patent application under Daniel's name was challenged and subsequently suspended pending review. The copyright on the Meridian Initiative and the Cascade Resilience Index was established without contest, because the evidentiary record I had assembled was, as Patricia noted, unusually complete. 3 of our top 5 clients, the ones whose contracts contained the essential personnel clauses, contacted the firm within 48 hours of the gala to inquire about the status of my role. When they were told that the matter was under review, 2 of them formally invoked their contract clauses, triggering review periods that created immediate uncertainty around $14.3 million in annual revenue. The firm's operating loans, as I had known for 7 months, contained covenant provisions. Specifically, provisions requiring the firm to maintain certain client revenue thresholds and to notify the lending institutions of material changes in key personnel. The uncertainty around the client contracts and the legal proceedings constituted, under the terms of those covenants, trigger events. The lending institutions began the notification and review process. The family's financial advisors described this, in a phone call my father made to me 4 days after the gala, as a margin situation. He called it a margin situation, 30 years of work, and the word he reached for was margin. I had moved, 3 months earlier, the proprietary datasets and system architectures I had developed, the core technical infrastructure of the Cascade Resilience Index and its implementation tools, into a separately incorporated entity. Mara Chen Consulting, LLC, registered in the state, with all relevant intellectual property correctly documented in its name. This was not a theft. I had legal counsel confirm that the materials I transferred were mine to transfer, predating my employment with Chen Logistics Solutions, or created during time that I was not compensated by the firm. It was a precautionary preservation, the kind of thing a systems architect does when they identify a high-risk single point of failure. The effect was that the Meridian Initiative, the strategy that was supposed to define the firm's next decade, could not be implemented without licensing the tools that made it function. And the tools belonged to me. My parents asked to meet. I agreed to meet them at a neutral location, a conference room at Alina Marsh's office, which I selected partly for its neutrality and partly because Alina's presence would ensure that the conversation remained in the realm of the documented and the precise. My mother spoke first. She said that family was more important than business, and that I had humiliated them in front of people who mattered, and that I needed to think about what I was doing to the name we shared. My father said that the firm was in trouble and that I was the only person who could stabilize it, and that the family needed me to be reasonable and to put this behind us and to save the family name. That phrase, save the family name. I thought about the third floor walk-up. I thought about table 14. I thought about the 14 months of lunch breaks and New Year's Eves. I thought about the 4 minutes of a phone call in which I was told that the work of my professional life had been given to someone else, and that I should continue to be a team player. I said, I can't deal with this right now. It was the exact sentence my father had said to me, in this same verbal register of dismissive finality. On the 7 occasions I had raised concerns about attribution, compensation, and professional recognition over 5 years of employment. I had written those occasions down too. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at me. Alina Marsh looked at her notepad and made a small notation. I thanked them for meeting with me, gathered my materials, and left. Part 8. The new structure Mara Chen Consulting opened its doors. Metaphorically, we are currently entirely remote, 11 weeks after the gala. Ruth Caldwell was our first client. She had spent the weeks following the gala conducting her own due diligence on the Meridian Initiative documentation, and she had concluded, with the analytical rigor of someone who had been evaluating investment opportunities for 3 decades, that the strategic intelligence behind it was real, that it was mine, and that it was worth retaining directly. The Hartfield distribution account followed 2 weeks later. By the end of the 3rd month, I had signed 4 clients, including 2 that had been Chen Logistics Solutions accounts, and 1 new client who had attended the gala as a guest of one of the venture partners and had reached out the following week to ask if I was available for a consulting engagement. The Cascade Resilience Index is now a licensed product. 4 supply chain consultancies have signed licensing agreements for its use. The patent application is proceeding in my name. My revenue in the first 6 months of operation exceeded my full-year salary from 5 years of employment at Chen Logistics Solutions. I am aware that this comparison is not the point of the exercise. The point was never the money, it was the accuracy of the record, but I include it because accuracy requires completeness. Chen Logistics Solutions is, as of the time of this recording, in a restructured state. 2 of the senior client accounts that departed have not returned. The operating loan situation was resolved, at significant cost, through a partial equity sale to a private investor. Daniel remains on the organizational chart with the title of CEO, which is, I understand, a continuing source of professional difficulty for him. Now that the actual functional work of the firm can no longer be attributed to his vision, and must be performed by people being paid to perform it and credited for performing it, he is, I am told, not enjoying the operational realities of the role. I find I have very few feelings about this, one way or the other. I do not wish him specific harm. I also do not experience guilt. He is navigating the consequences of a system he participated in building, and from which he benefited materially for a very long time. Those consequences are appropriate to the system. My parents have not reached out since the conference room meeting, except for a message from my mother at the holidays that was warm in tone and made no reference to any of the events of the preceding months. I responded briefly and warmly, and have left the question of what the relationship becomes to a later date, when the immediate structural work is complete enough to allow for the slower, more complicated work of deciding what you want to preserve from a thing that was built partly on fiction. I live now in an apartment with a working elevator. It has 1,100 square feet and a window that faces east. I drink my morning coffee at a table in front of that window, and I watch the light come in and I work on things that are mine, and that are documented as mine, and that will remain mine. The lesson, which is also a warning, everything beautiful starts with structure. A firm, a strategy, a family, a career. These are all, at their foundation, architectural projects. They are systems with load-bearing elements and design principles and dependencies that propagate through every subsequent decision. When you build a structure on a false premise, the false premise becomes a load-bearing element. The fiction holds weight. The lie becomes structural, and as long as nothing tests the foundation, everything above it can look perfectly stable. The building stands, the shareholders applaud. The golden child cuts the ribbon at the door that someone else built. But structures are tested. That is the nature of systems. Stresses accumulate, dependencies shift, and when the test comes, and it always comes, the question is not whether the false foundation will fail, but how much of the structure above it will come down when it does. I did not cause the failure of the foundation at Chen Logistics Solutions. I documented it. I mapped it. I created an alternative structure that could sustain the weight I had been carrying, and I transferred the load to the new foundation before the old one gave way entirely. This is what systems architects do. We do not create crises. We identify the crises that were already embedded in the design, and we find solutions before they become catastrophic. Or, when they have already passed that threshold, we build something better in the cleared space. I am 31 years old. I have a firm, 4 clients, a licensing product, and a view that faces east. The record is accurate, the structure is sound, that is sufficient before I close. If you were in my position, which path would you have chosen? A. Forgiven them, stayed, absorbed the loss, protected the family name. B. Sued for every dollar of profit generated through misattributed work. C. Taken your skills and built your own thing from the ground up. Leave your answer in the comments. Tell me your reasoning. The interesting part of questions like this one is rarely the answer. It is the architecture of the thinking that gets you there.